Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The night Lydia came into the world, the ocean held its breath. 3 moons hung in the star-drunk sky above Saltmere. One pale and full, 2 smaller wanderers pulled briefly into our orbit by some gravitational poetry that occurs perhaps once in 1,000 years. The lighthouse beam swept across waters so still they might have been polished glass, and even the seabirds had fallen silent, as if the universe itself was pausing to witness something extraordinary. In the small cottage that perched like a weathered shell on Saltmere's rocky shore, steam curled from the kettle and drifted through rooms lit by oil lamp and that strange silver moonlight. Clara, the lighthouse keeper's daughter, labored not with the usual cries that tear through birthing nights, but with soft, rhythmic sighs that seemed to echo the gentle pulse of the tide below. Her mother, Marin, knelt beside her with the same gentle certainty she used to coax injured gulls back to flight. Her weathered hands reading the night like tea leaves. "Something's different," Ilara whispered, her voice carrying wonder instead of worry. The contractions had stopped coming with their urgent rhythm and moved instead like tides, slow, deep, ancient. The triple moonlight cast everything in silver and shadow, making familiar objects look like artifacts from a dream. When Lydia finally arrived, she didn't announce herself with vigorous protest, but with a gentle sigh, a soft exhalation that seemed to harmonize with the wind moving through the cottage's weathered beams. Her eyes opened immediately, wide sea-glass eyes that reflected the triple moonlight with an intensity that made both women catch their breath. She looked not at them, but past them, as if she were seeing threads of connection invisible to everyone else. Tilda, the village midwife, arrived just as the first moon began to set. She was a practical woman who delivered dozens of Saltmere babies, but she stopped in the doorway as if she'd walked into a cathedral. Later she would tell her husband that she saw threads of silver light dancing around the newborn, fine as spider silk, but she'd dismiss this as exhaustion and the strange effects of the triple moonlight. What she couldn't dismiss was the way the cottage felt, as if it were holding something precious and fragile, like a music box that had just finished playing a melody. Marin lifted Lydia into her arms and felt it immediately. The child was listening. Not to the sounds of the world she'd just entered, but to something else entirely, something that hummed beneath the surface of ordinary experience, like a song played in a frequency just beyond normal hearing. The baby's tiny fingers moved in the air, as if she were touching invisible threads, her gaze fixed on spaces between things, rather than the things themselves. "She's hearing something we've forgotten how to hear," Marin murmured, cradling her granddaughter against her chest. When she placed Lydia in Ilara's arms, the baby turned her head toward the corner, where an old rocking chair sat waiting, the same chair that had belonged to Marin's own grandmother, the one that had rocked 3 generations of babies to sleep with lullabies that lingered in its wooden memory. As dawn approached and the 2 wandering moons faded into the lightening sky, the cottage settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, but something had changed in its very foundation. The air itself seemed more aware, more attentive. Marin made tea while Ilara dozed, cutting thick slices of bread and laying out butter that softened in the warmth. Simple things, but they felt ceremonial somehow, like offerings to mark the arrival of something extraordinary disguised as ordinary. The lighthouse beam continued its steady sweep across the calming waters, and old Henrik, steady as the stone beneath that tower, tended his light without knowing that in the cottage below, a life had arrived that would later help him name sorrows he hadn't yet earned, and joys he'd forgotten he'd lost. Lydia slept in her mother's arms, but even in sleep, her small hand remained open, fingers slightly curved, as if she were still reaching for those invisible threads that only she could see. When Marin finally settled into the rocking chair to keep watch, she felt the familiar warmth that had nothing to do with the wood or fabric, the accumulated love of all the mothers and grandmothers who had rocked their babies here, humming songs that became part of the chair's grain. "We'll learn to listen together, little one," Marin whispered, the same way she addressed seabirds with broken wings, not because she believed the child needed mending, but because some things deserve the dignity of soft words. "There's time. There's all the time we need." Outside, the tide was turning, carrying with it the whispered promise that some gifts arrive, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of dawn following the darkest night. And in the gentle rhythm of the waves against the shore, in the settling sighs of the old cottage, in the soft breathing of a child who had entered the world already reaching for something beyond the ordinary, the first chapter of an extraordinary story had begun to write itself in the patient language of love and time. The rocking chair held them both, grandmother and granddaughter, as the last of the 3 moons disappeared into morning. Somewhere in the cottage walls, in the grain of its wood and the salt in its stones, the memory of this night began to weave itself into the foundation of everything that would follow. Lydia had been born not just under 3 moons, but into a world that was finally ready to remember how to listen to its own forgotten songs. The months that followed Lydia's birth moved like gentle tides, each day bringing small revelations that Marin collected like sea glass, holding them up to the light to understand their true nature. Winter softened into spring, and spring gave way to summer, while the cottage breathed with the rhythm of ordinary days, made extraordinary by the presence of a child who seemed to listen to the world's hidden songs. Salt gathered in the window frames like fine lace, and gulls cawed like distant cousins checking in, their voices weaving into the familiar symphony of Saltmere's coastal life. By her second winter, Lydia had grown into a curious toddler who moved through the cottage with the careful attention of someone reading a beloved book for the second time. Her steps were deliberate, her sea-glass eyes thoughtful, and she had developed the habit of touching things, door frames, window sills, the smooth stones Marin kept on the mantel, as if she were greeting old friends. While other children might chase butterflies or stack wooden blocks with abandon, Lydia often found herself drawn to the quiet corners of their home, her tiny hands reaching out to caress the worn fabric of cushions or the cool surface of ceramic bowls that had served countless meals. These were not random explorations, but something deeper, more purposeful. She would sometimes pat a patch of wall as if comforting an unseen friend, or pause by the kitchen window with her head cocked, listening to melodies that played only for her. Alara and Marin learned early that Lydia wasn't seeing empty air, she was simply seeing more, feeling the invisible threads that connected present moments to all the love and life that had come before. But it was the old rocking chair, tucked in the sunniest corner of the main room, that held the strongest pull. The chair had belonged to Marin's grandmother, a woman whose memory was more scent of lavender and sound of soft laughter than sharp, clear image. With its polished, worn runners and faded floral cushion, it was a relic of generations, its purpose seemingly fulfilled, now resting in quiet retirement. To Alara it was beloved furniture, to Marin a vessel of warm remembrance. To Lydia, however, it seemed to pulse with an almost visible warmth. It happened on a February afternoon, when the wind carried the sharp scent of snow and the lighthouse beams seemed to struggle against the gathering dusk. Marin was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of fish stew and listening to the familiar sounds of her granddaughter's exploration, the soft pad of small feet, the gentle thud of wooden blocks being stacked and toppled. The cottage held these sounds like cupped hands, amplifying the ordinary music of a child at play. But then the sound stopped, replaced by something else entirely. A humming, soft and melodic, drifted from the sitting room like smoke from a banked fire. Marin set down her wooden spoon and moved toward the doorway, her heart quickening with a recognition she couldn't yet name. The melody was achingly familiar, each note falling into place like puzzle pieces she'd been searching for all her life. There, in the corner where winter light filtered through lace curtains, sat Lydia in the old rocking chair. Her tiny hands gripped the worn armrests, her feet dangling inches from the floor, and she was rocking with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The chair answered with its familiar wood voice, a gentle creaking that seemed to harmonize with something beyond the visible world. The humming rose from her throat like water from a deep well, pure and unconscious, a lullaby that belonged to another time entirely. Marin's breath caught in her chest. The melody was her own grandmother's, the same lullaby that had soothed 3 generations of restless babies, the one that had died with great-grandmother Isla nearly 20 years ago. No one had sung it since. No one alive even remembered the words. Yet here was Lydia barely walking, humming every note with perfect unconscious precision, as if the chair itself were teaching her the forgotten song. The late afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing around the chair, and for just a moment, Marin could have sworn she saw them moving in patterns, like notes on an invisible staff. Lydia's humming grew softer, more distant, as if she were singing not just the melody, but the memory of it, the way it had sounded when whispered into a baby's ear at midnight, when crooned over a fevered child, when hummed absently while mending clothes by lamplight. Tears arrived before understanding, warm and unexpected, tracing paths down Marin's weathered cheeks. It wasn't sadness that brought them, but the immense beauty of witnessing love transcend time, carried on the breath of a child. The chair held Lydia's small form with the tenderness of arms that had cradled countless children, and Lydia seemed to understand this, settling deeper into its embrace with the trust of someone coming home. When Ilara returned from the village shop with bread under her arm and salt in her hair, she found them there, Marin weeping softly with a beatific smile, watching Lydia rock and hum in the chair that had been, waiting patiently for someone who could hear its accumulated love and give it voice again through an ancient lullaby that refused to be forgotten. The weeks that followed the rocking chair revelation unfolded like pages in a well-loved book, each day bringing small confirmations of what Marin and Ilara were beginning to understand. Lydia moved through their cottage with increasing purpose, her tiny hands seeking out objects that held more than their visible weight. She would pause at the kitchen windowsill to touch the smooth river stones Marin had collected over decades, her fingers tracing their surfaces as if reading stories written in their cool curves. The pewter candlesticks that had belonged to Ilara's father received gentle pats, and the wooden spoon worn smooth by countless meals earned soft whispers of greeting. These weren't the random explorations of an ordinary toddler, but something deeper, a careful tending to the emotional echoes that lived within familiar things. When Lydia touched the brass doorknob that had welcomed 3 generations of visitors, her face would soften with recognition, as if she could feel every hand that had turned it, every homecoming it had witnessed. The cottage itself seemed to respond to her presence, settling into its evening creaks with what felt like contentment, as if finally someone was listening to all the stories it had been keeping. By the time spring painted the coastal cliffs with wild lupine and sea thrift, Lydia had grown into a thoughtful 5-year-old, whose vocabulary had expanded to include not just words but a language of gentle touches and knowing glances. She still sought out the rocking chair each evening, humming fragments of melodies that belonged to no particular time, but felt ancient as the tides. Sometimes Marin would catch her having quiet conversations with empty corners, her head tilted in the listening posture that had become her signature way of moving through the world. "She's not talking to herself," Marin explained to Ilara one morning as they watched Lydia pause by the garden gate, her small hand resting on the weathered wood while she murmured something too soft to hear. "She's acknowledging what's already there. The love that gets left behind when people move on, it doesn't disappear. It just waits for someone who knows how to say hello." Ilara had come to trust her mother's wisdom about such things, especially as she witnessed her daughter's gift bringing unexpected peace to their home. Objects that had once carried the weight of loss, her father's pipe, her grandmother's sewing basket, now seemed to pulse with gentle warmth whenever Lydia was near, as if her presence somehow transformed grief into gratitude. It was on a crystalline morning in late spring, when the lighthouse beam caught dewdrops like scattered diamonds, and the air carried the green scent of growing things, that Lydia's explorations led her beyond their familiar boundaries. She had been playing quietly in the garden, arranging shells in patterns that seemed meaningful only to her, when she suddenly lifted her head with the alert attention of someone hearing their name called from a distance. "Mama," she said, tugging on Ilara's skirt with unusual urgency. "Someone wants to play." The 3 of them followed the invisible thread that seemed to pull Lydia through the village, past the baker's shop where Mrs. Henley waved from her flower-dusted window, beyond the harbour where fishing boats bobbed like patient horses waiting for their riders. Lydia's steps quickened as they approached the old stone church, its bell tower casting long shadows across the cobblestones, but she didn't stop at the familiar sanctuary. Instead, she led them around the building's weathered corner to a place that had been forgotten by most of Saltmere's adults, but never truly abandoned. The playground sat in a small clearing behind the church, its metal swings hanging motionless in the still air, its wooden slide worn smooth by countless summers of laughter. Weeds had begun to claim the edges, and rust bloomed on the chains like iron flowers. But to Lydia, the space seemed to shimmer with invisible activity. She approached the swing set with the reverence she usually reserved for the rocking chair, her sea-glass eyes wide with recognition. When she placed her small palms against the cold metal chains, the transformation was immediate. Her face lit up with pure joy, as if she had just been welcomed into a circle of beloved friends. She began to push one of the empty swings with careful attention, stepping back to watch its arc through the air, then clapping her hands together in delight. "It's their turn," she announced, speaking to Elara and Marin, but clearly addressing others as well. They've been waiting so long to play, standing there in the morning light, watching their extraordinary child tend to the lingering joy of generations of children who had loved this place. Elara felt her understanding deepen like roots finding water. Lydia wasn't seeing ghosts or living in fantasy. She was perceiving the emotional imprints that love leaves behind, the happiness that soaks into places like sunlight into stone. The playground wasn't empty. It was full of every laugh, every friendship, every moment of pure childhood bliss that had ever happened here. Marin settled onto a weathered bench, pulling her shawl closer against the morning chill, and smiled as she watched Lydia begin what looked like an elaborate game of invisible tag. "She's teaching us how to see with our hearts," she murmured to Elara. "How to remember that love never really leaves. It just changes form." The swing continued its gentle arc, pushed by small hands that understood the sacred duty of keeping joy alive while somewhere in the distance, the lighthouse beam swept across waters that held their own collection of forgotten moments, waiting patiently for someone who knew how to listen to their endless, gentle songs. The morning after the playground revelation, Marin woke with the weight of purpose settling around her shoulders like a familiar shawl. She had spent the night listening to the tide's ancient rhythm, understanding that her role in Lydia's life was shifting from observer to guide. As she prepared their morning tea, watching steam curl toward the cottage's weathered beams, she felt the same careful responsibility she'd once felt when, nursing injured seabirds back to flight, the sea wag, knowledge that gentle hands and patient wisdom could help something fragile learn to soar. "Little one," she said as Lydia settled into the rocking chair with her porridge. "Yesterday you helped some friends who were waiting to play. Would you like to learn more about these special friends you can feel?" Lydia's sea-glass eyes brightened with the eager expression of a child finally invited to share a treasured secret. "They're everywhere, grandmother. In the walls, in the garden gate, even in your sewing basket. They feel like warm spots where love got left behind, like when you sit in a chair after someone else has been there, and it still feels cozy." Marin nodded, her heart expanding with understanding. "That's exactly right, dear one. Those warm spots are what I call forgotten moments. Not ghosts or hauntings, but simply love that has nowhere else to go. It waits in places and objects, hoping someone with a gentle heart will notice and say hello." From that day forward, their walks through Saltmere became a form of quiet education. Each morning after breakfast, Marin would tuck herbs and a small notebook into her wicker basket, and together they would move through the village like careful readers exploring a beloved book. Lydia learned to match her breathing to the rise and fall of the tide, so that even before they reached a place rich with forgotten moments, calm had already found them. "Before you listen," Marin taught her, pausing beside the old stone bridge where the river whispered toward the sea, "ask if you are needed. Not everything wants company. Not everything is ready. Love has boundaries, just like gardens have fences." Lydia would nod with the seriousness of a sparrow, and together they would stand in patient silence, letting the answer arrive in the way the air softened, or a warmth touched their skin like sunlight through cloud. The bridge became one of their favorite teaching places, its weathered stones carved with decades of initials, where young lovers had proclaimed their devotion. When Lydia placed her palm against one set of letters, her face would soften as she felt the echo of that young love, now grown into something deeper and more complex. "They're still happy," she would report to Marin. "Different happy than when they carved this, but still happy." "That's the beautiful thing about love," Marin would reply, adjusting the herbs in her basket. "It grows and changes, but it never disappears. Even when people move away or grow old, the love they shared stays woven into the places where they loved each other." Marin taught Lydia to carry 2 smooth shells in her pocket, one for grounding when emotions became overwhelming, one to leave as a quiet offering of gratitude. when forgotten moments pressed too heavily, threatening to sweep her granddaughter away like a strong current, Marin would guide her through simple anchoring. Feel your heels on the ground, tongue to the roof of your mouth. Count 5 things you can see right now. These techniques became as natural as breathing, helping Lydia learn to witness without drowning. The breakthrough came on a morning when fog rolled in from the sea, like a gentle grey blanket, muffling the familiar sounds of the harbour. They had walked to the old pier where fishing boats bobbed like patient horses, their masts disappearing into the mist. Lydia had been unusually quiet, her small hand clasped firmly in Marin's, when she suddenly stopped and turned toward the pier's end. "There's something very big here," she said, her voice carrying a new quality, not excitement but something deeper and more solemn. Not sad exactly, but heavy, like when you're holding something precious and you don't want to drop it. Marin followed her granddaughter's gaze to where the wooden planks disappeared into grey nothingness. She knew this place held the accumulated weight of countless hellos and goodbyes, generations of families saying farewell to sons heading to sea, wives waiting for boats that sometimes didn't return, reunions celebrated and losses grieved. Lydia closed her eyes and took the same deep, listening breath she used when settling into the rocking chair. When she opened them again, tears had gathered at their corners, but her expression was peaceful rather than distressed. "It's all the hellos and goodbyes," she whispered, "all mixed together like colors in water, but it's not trying to make me feel anything. It's just being itself, like a big library full of stories I don't need to read all at once. I can just visit them when I want to, and say thank you for being part of the world." Standing there in the fog-wrapped harbour, Marin felt tears of pride gather in her own eyes. Her granddaughter had found the key to living peacefully with her extraordinary gift, not to be consumed by forgotten moments, but to serve as their gentle witness. "You understand perfectly, little one," she murmured. "You're learning to be a window, not a well. Let the love pass through you, not pool inside you." As they walked home through the lifting mist, Lydia tucked her smaller shell into a crevice between the pier's weathered boards. "For the ones who come after," she whispered, and the breeze agreed with a tiny kiss across her cheek. The lighthouse beam swept steadily across the clearing waters, and somewhere in its patient rhythm, both grandmother and granddaughter heard the promise that love, in all its forms, never truly disappears. It simply waits to be remembered and woven back into the world's endless story of connection. The understanding that bloomed between Lydia and Marin during their lessons at the pier became like a shared language, spoken in gentle touches and knowing glances. As autumn painted the coastal cliffs in shades of amber and rust, their daily walks through Saltmere took on the rhythm of a quiet ministry. Lydia's gift had grown more nuanced, her ability to distinguish between different types of forgotten moments becoming as natural as reading the weather in the color of the sky. She could feel the difference between joy that lingered like sunshine on warm stones and sorrow that pooled in corners like morning shadows, waiting for acknowledgement. It was during this season of deepening wisdom that change came to the lighthouse that had stood sentinel over Saltmere for as long as anyone could remember. Old Henrik, the keeper whose steady presence had been as reliable as the tides themselves, found his world transformed by loss. His wife Astrid had been the gentle heart of their shared life, tending the small garden that bloomed defiantly against the salt winds, filling their cottage with the warm scent of fresh bread, and keeping Henrik company during the long nights when he tended the beacon that guided ships safely home. When Astrid passed quietly in her sleep on a Tuesday morning, when the sea lay calm as polished silver, Henrik continued his duties with the mechanical precision of a man who had forgotten how to feel anything beyond the turning of gears and the lighting of wicks. The lighthouse beam still swept its faithful arc across the waters, but something essential had dimmed, not the light itself, but the love that had always guided its purpose. Lydia felt the change immediately, even from their cottage across the village. The lighthouse, which had always pulsed with the warm rhythm of shared purpose and quiet contentment, now felt heavy with unspoken grief. When she looked toward the tower during their morning walks, her sea-glass eyes would cloud with concern. "The light is still working," she told Marin one grey afternoon as they prepared their simple lunch, "but it feels so lonely now, like it's calling for someone who can't answer anymore." Marin understood. In the week since Astrid's funeral, Henrik had become a shadow moving through familiar routines, avoiding the market conversations and church gatherings that had once punctuated his days. His grief had wrapped around him like fog, thick and impenetrable, cutting him off from the community that wanted to offer comfort, but didn't know how to reach through his determined isolation. "Perhaps," Marin said gently, wrapping herb bread in clean linen. "It's time to visit the lighthouse, not to fix anything, but simply to acknowledge what's there. Sometimes grief needs witnesses more than solutions." They walked to the lighthouse on an afternoon when clouds hung low and the sea moved restlessly against the rocks. Marin carried her bread and a jar of the fish stew that had comforted 3 generations of Saltmere families, while Lydia held a small bouquet of late-blooming asters, their purple faces bright against the overcast sky. The lighthouse stood solid against the gathering dusk, its white stones weathered but enduring, its light already beginning to pierce the approaching gloom. Henrik answered their knock with the wariness of someone who had grown weary of well-meaning visits. His weathered face, usually animated by quick smiles and ready conversation, had settled into lines of exhaustion. His clothes hung loose on his diminished frame, and his eyes held the distant look of someone present in body but absent in spirit. "Mrs. Marin." "Little Lydia," he said, his voice carrying the hollow courtesy of someone going through expected motions. "Kind of you to visit." Lydia stepped forward with the gentle directness that had become her signature, offering the asters like a small prayer. "We brought these for the lighthouse," she said, her voice carrying that particular quality of truth that children possess. "They wanted to visit all the love that still lives here." Henrik's carefully maintained composure wavered for just a moment, confusion and something deeper flickering across his features. He looked down at this extraordinary child who spoke of love living in stones and metal, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and for the first time in weeks, something other than duty stirred in his chest. Inside the lighthouse cottage, Lydia moved with her characteristic reverence, her small hands touching surfaces with the respect of someone greeting old friends. She paused beside the kitchen table where countless meals had been shared, her palm resting gently on the worn wood. "There's so much happiness here," she said softly, her eyes bright with recognition rather than pity. Morning tea and evening conversations, and the sound of laughter mixing with the sound of waves. She looked up at Henrik with wonder filling her voice. "She's still here, isn't she?" In the way the kitchen remembers how she moved through it, in the garden that still knows how her hands felt. Henrik sank into his usual chair, watching this child acknowledge the presence he had been trying so hard to deny. "I can't feel her anymore," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I keep expecting to hear her humming or smell her bread baking. But there's just silence." Lydia approached him with the same gentle care she used with injured birds, settling cross-legged on the floor beside his chair. "She's not gone," she said with quiet certainty. "Love doesn't disappear when people do. It gets woven into everything they touched. The lighthouse knows she loved you here. The garden remembers her hands. Even the light itself carries some of her caring." As if summoned by her words, the lighthouse beam began its evening rotation, and in its steady sweep across the darkening waters, Henrik felt something shift. Not healing that would take time, but recognition. The lighthouse had always been more than his job. It had been their shared purpose, their way of caring for everyone who depended on safe passage through dangerous waters. Marin quietly prepared tea, while Lydia continued her gentle inventory of love made visible, helping Henrik begin to understand that grief and gratitude could occupy the same heart, that remembering could be a form of presence rather than absence. When they left that evening, the lighthouse didn't feel lighter exactly, but it felt inhabited again, as if sorrow had been invited to sit at the table instead of haunting the doorway. The beam swept on steady and sure, carrying with it not just Henrik's duty, but the accumulated love of 2 people who had spent their lives guiding others safely. Home, the weeks that followed their lighthouse. Visits brought a gentle transformation to Saltmere, like morning mist slowly lifting to reveal familiar landscapes touched with new light. Henrik began leaving small gifts on their doorstep. A jar of honey, wildflowers from Astrid's recovering garden, a smooth stone worn by decades of tides. These offerings arrived without words, but spoke volumes about a heart learning to open again. Lydia would touch each gift with her characteristic reverence, feeling the gratitude and tentative hope that Henrik couldn't yet voice, and Marin would smile as she arranged the flowers, understanding that healing, like the tide, comes and goes in its own rhythm. It was during this season of quiet renewal that the stranger arrived, walking up the coastal road on an afternoon when the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain. He moved with the unhurried gait of someone accustomed to covering long distances, carrying a worn leather satchel and a guitar case that had clearly seen more miles than most people. His hair was the color of driftwood, streaked with silver that caught what little light filtered through the clouds, and his clothes bore the comfortable wrinkles of a life lived more in motion than in any particular place. Finn McCready introduced himself to the village with the easy courtesy of someone who had learned to be a welcome stranger in many places. But it was when he settled on the bench outside the Fisherman's Rest, tuning his guitar, as the first drops of rain began to fall, that Saltmere truly met him. The notes that drifted across the village square carried something that made people pause in their evening routines. Not urgency, but a quality that seemed to reach directly into the chest and wake up feelings that had been quietly sleeping. Lydia heard the music from their cottage garden, where she had been helping Marin gather late herbs before the weather turned. The melody seemed to call to something deep in her awareness, not just the sound itself, but the emotional resonance that surrounded it like visible warmth. She set down her small basket and turned toward the village center with the same alert attention she showed when approaching places rich with forgotten moments. "Someone's playing music," she told Marin, but her voice carried wonder rather than simple observation. The guitar remembers so many songs, so many places where people felt things deeply. They found Finn surrounded by a small gathering of villagers who had been drawn by the same magnetic pull that Lydia felt. His fingers moved across the strings with fluid grace, and the melodies he chose seemed to reach into the collective memory of everyone listening. When he played a slow, haunting air, Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her eyes, remembering her late husband's love of sea shanties. When he shifted to something bright and celebratory, young Tom Fletcher found himself smiling for the first time since his fishing boat had been damaged in recent storms. But it was Lydia who seemed to fascinate Finn most. While other listeners swayed or closed their eyes to better absorb the music, she stood perfectly still, her sea-glass eyes fixed not on him, but on his guitar. Her expression held the same reverent attention she gave to objects rich with emotional history, and when he finished each song, she would nod slightly, as if acknowledging something only she could perceive. During a pause between songs, when the gathered villagers were murmuring appreciation, Finn caught Lydia's eye and smiled. "You're listening to more than the music, aren't you, little one?" Lydia stepped closer, drawn by the same instinct that had always guided her toward places where love had left its mark. "Your guitar has been to so many places where people felt happy or sad or grateful. It remembers wedding dances and funeral songs and lullabies for babies who couldn't sleep. It's like a library, but instead of books, it holds all the feelings that music helped people express." Finn's weathered face softened with understanding and something that might have been relief. "Would you like to touch it? Sometimes instruments like to share their memories with people who know how to listen properly." When Lydia placed her small palms against the worn wood of the guitar's body, her face lit up with the same joy she showed when discovering a particularly rich, forgotten moment. The instrument had indeed traveled countless miles, absorbing the emotional resonance of every performance, every gathering, every moment when music had served as a bridge between human hearts. She could feel echoes of celebration and mourning, of love songs whispered in moonlight and work songs that had made difficult labor bearable. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her hands tracing the guitar's curves with reverent care. All the happiness and sadness mixed together, like colors in water. The guitar doesn't judge which feelings are good or bad. It just holds them all and helps them become music. Over the following days, Finn became an unexpected mentor, teaching Lydia that forgotten moments weren't just about sadness or longing. Joy too left its traces, sometimes even more potent for its fleeting nature. He showed her how music could weave emotional threads back into the present, allowing people to step into forgotten memories, feel their warmth or ache, and carry that understanding forward. "Music is mostly air and time," he told her one morning as they sat by the harbor. "Notes are only places where we agree to meet. The real magic happens in the spaces between, where memory and hope learned to dance together. And in those gentle lessons, Lydia began to understand that her gift wasn't just about witnessing forgotten moments, but about helping them find their way back into the world's endless song of connection. The music stayed with Lydia long after Finn packed his weathered guitar and followed the coastal road toward distant harbors. His lessons had become like smooth stones in her pocket, reminders that forgotten moments held joy as well as sorrow, that the spaces between notes were as important as the melodies themselves. When she hummed fragments of the songs he taught her, she could feel how music wove emotional threads back into the present, allowing memories to dance with hope in the gentle rhythm of everyday life. As autumn painted the cliffs in shades of amber and rust, Lydia faced a new challenge that would test everything she had learned about living peacefully with her extraordinary gift. The village school, housed in a stone building that had sheltered generations of Saltmere children, called to her with the same insistent pull she felt from places rich with forgotten moments. But unlike the gentle, settled echoes of the rocking chair or the playground's joyful memories, the school pulsed with a complex symphony of accumulated emotions that threatened to overwhelm her careful equilibrium. The moment she crossed the threshold on her first morning, Lydia felt the building's emotional history wash over her like a powerful tide. The hallways hummed with decades of hurried footsteps and whispered secrets, while classrooms held the lingering tension of countless examinations, the quiet pride of problems solved, and the frustrated sighs of students who had struggled with difficult lessons. Test anxiety from children long grown pressed against her awareness like fog, mingling with the excitement of first crushes, the ache of playground rejections, and the bittersweet joy of friendships formed over shared confidences. The wooden desks bore the invisible imprints of nervous hands and idle doodling, each surface polished by the hopes and fears of students who had sat there before her. The very air seemed thick with the accumulated weight of young hearts, learning to navigate the complexities of growing up, and Lydia found herself struggling to breathe beneath the emotional sediment of nearly a century of childhood experiences. While other children chattered and fidgeted through their morning lessons, Lydia sat perfectly still, her sea-glass eyes wide with the effort of processing sensations that belonged to other times, other lives. Her small hands pressed flat against her desk's scarred surface, and her breathing took on the careful, measured quality of someone trying not to drown in a sea of borrowed feelings. Mrs. Ashford, whose gentle authority had guided 3 generations of Saltmere children, noticed immediately that something was different about her new student. During the mid-morning break, she knelt beside Lydia's desk with the same intuitive grace that made her beloved by countless families. "You seem to be listening to something the rest of us can't hear," she said softly, her voice creating space rather than demanding attention. "Would it help to step outside for a moment?" That evening, Marin found her granddaughter curled in the familiar embrace of the rocking chair, tears streaming down her cheeks as she struggled with the overwhelming nature of her gift in this new environment. "At home, the forgotten moments feel like friends visiting," Lydia whispered. "But at school, they all want to be heard at once. And I can't listen to everyone properly without losing myself." This was the crisis Marin had been quietly preparing for, understanding that Lydia's sensitivity would eventually require more sophisticated management. Together, they began developing what Marin called quiet spaces, not shutting out the forgotten moments entirely, but learning to create calm within herself, even when surrounded by emotional storms. "Imagine you're our lighthouse," Marin suggested, her weathered hands gentle on Lydia's shoulders. The beam sweeps across the water, illuminating what's there, but the lighthouse itself stays rooted to its foundation. You can acknowledge what you're feeling without becoming it. The forgotten moments aren't trying to consume you. They're simply hoping to be witnessed. Marin taught her granddaughter breathing techniques that anchored her to the present moment, ways of grounding herself, even when surrounded by echoes from the past. "Feel your feet on the floor," she would whisper. When Lydia's eyes grew distant, "Count 5 things you can see right now. Remember that you are Lydia in this moment, and all the feelings around you are visitors, not residents." Mrs. Ashford, with the wisdom that made her a natural ally, began creating small accommodations that helped Lydia navigate the school's emotional complexity. A seat near the window where natural light could serve as an anchor, Permission to step into the hallway when the forgotten moments grew too insistent, and most importantly, recognition that Lydia's unusual sensitivity was a gift rather than a burden to be managed. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging mathematics lesson, when Lydia felt herself being pulled under by the accumulated frustration of generations of students who had struggled with equations. She closed her eyes, felt her feet firmly on the wooden floor, and envisioned her inner space as a calm pool where emotional echoes became ripples on the surface, observed but not absorbed. When she opened her eyes, the clamor hadn't disappeared, but it had softened into a manageable hum. She had learned to be a lighthouse indeed, rooted in her own foundation, while offering steady guidance to others navigating difficult waters. The mastery Lydia had gained over her gift during those challenging school months became like a well-tuned instrument, each technique refined through practice until creating quiet spaces within herself felt as natural as breathing. Her classmates had begun to notice, without quite understanding why, that anxiety seemed to settle when she was near. And even Mrs. Ashford remarked that the classroom held a different quality of peace when Lydia was centered and present. The forgotten moments no longer threatened to sweep her away like dangerous currents. Instead, they became trusted companions, each with its own voice in the vast choir of human experience. As winter painted Saltmere in shades of silver and pearl, Lydia's explorations of the village's emotional landscape deepened beyond the familiar territories of home and playground. She had learned to distinguish between moments that yearned for acknowledgement and those that preferred to rest undisturbed, developing an intuitive respect for the boundaries that even love observes. Her gift had evolved from overwhelming sensitivity into something more refined, a gentle lighthouse beam that could illuminate forgotten corners without disturbing their essential peace. It was during one of these explorations, on an afternoon when salt-scented wind carried the promise of snow and the harbour lay still as polished pewter, that Lydia felt an unusual pull toward the village post office. The building sat on the square like a patient guardian, its weathered stone walls holding decades of hopes carried on paper wings toward distant hearts. As she approached the familiar entrance, where Mr. Alden Rowe had sorted mail with quiet dedication for nearly 30 years, she felt the characteristic warmth that indicated the presence of something emotionally significant. Inside, dust motes danced in afternoon light, while Mr. Rowe arranged letters with the careful attention of someone who understood that each envelope carried a fragment of someone's world. The familiar sounds of rustling paper and the gentle thud of stamps created a rhythm that spoke of connection, spanning distances, of love reaching across miles to find its intended home. But it was toward the back corner of the building, where shadows gathered between afternoon and evening, that Lydia felt drawn with unusual insistence. "You're listening to something again, aren't you, little one?" Mr. Rowe asked gently, his weathered hands pausing in their work. He had grown accustomed to Lydia's visits, understanding that she perceived layers of meaning in places where others saw only familiar routine. The forgotten moment revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in gentle solution. In that shadowed corner, behind a narrow cabinet that had stood unchanged for decades, Lydia felt the presence of words that had never found their intended destination. When Mr. Rowe opened the cabinet with trembling hands, revealing a single envelope wrapped in fading blue ribbon, the full weight of the forgotten moment settled around them like morning mist. The letter bore an address in elegant script, Miss Eleanor Vance, Rosemary Cottage, Port Blossom, with a stamp that had never fulfilled its purpose. As Lydia placed her fingers gently on the aged paper, she felt the story unfold through her heightened awareness, a young man's trembling hope as he wrote by candlelight, pouring his heart onto paper with the desperate courage of first love. She sensed his breathless anticipation as he sealed the envelope, his dreams of a shared future dancing like fireflies in his imagination. But the letter had been mislaid in the careful choreography of postal delivery, set aside and forgotten, until it became part of the building's emotional sediment. Lydia felt the writer's growing confusion as days turned to weeks without reply, his hope gradually crystallizing into the painful acceptance that his feelings had perhaps been one-sided. She sensed Eleanor's own bewilderment and hurt when no word came from the young man she had been learning to love, her own letters growing shorter and less frequent until correspondence ceased entirely. "I found it too late," Mr. Rowe whispered, his voice carrying decades of regret. "By the time I discovered my mistake, they had both moved on, built different lives. I kept it, not knowing whether to send it into the world like a message in a bottle or let it rest with its secrets intact." Standing in that quiet corner, Lydia discovered something unexpected, woven through the forgotten moment's complexity. The love that had fueled that long-ago letter hadn't simply withered with disappointment. Instead, it had transformed, becoming something deeper and more nuanced, a recognition that some connections transcend the need for reciprocation, that the act of loving fully, even without response, creates its own form of completion. The young man had eventually learned humility and appreciation for connection that served him well in later relationships. Eleanor, too, had carried forward the intensity of that almost love, using it to recognize and cherish the affection that did find her. Their separate paths had been shaped by the absence of that letter, but not diminished by it. "Would it be all right," Lydia asked softly, "if we made a place for it, not to fix what happened, but to honor the love it tried to carry?" Together, they cleared a small shelf near the window that welcomed morning light, dusting it with the reverence reserved for sacred spaces. Lydia placed one of her smooth shells upon the clean surface, the one she carried for gratitude, while Mr. Rowe set the letter down like a traveler finally finding rest. In his careful script, he wrote a small note. "Thank you for the love you tried to deliver," and placed it beside the envelope. The forgotten moment seemed to exhale, not resolved but acknowledged, its burden of unfinished business transformed into something gentler. Lydia had learned that some stories don't require endings, only witnesses, hearts willing to honor the full spectrum of human longing, including the beautiful ache of what almost was. The ritual they had created in the post office became a touchstone for Lydia, a reminder that some forgotten moments required not resolution, but reverence. In the days that followed, she found herself returning to that quiet corner where the undelivered letter rested in its place of honor, feeling how the space had transformed from a repository of regret into something more like a chapel. The morning light that touched the small shelf seemed warmer somehow, as if the acknowledgement itself had opened a pathway for grace to enter the world. This deepened understanding of her gift's true purpose, to witness rather than to fix, created a subtle shift in how Lydia moved through Saltmere. The forgotten moments no longer felt like overwhelming voices demanding attention, but like gentle threads in an intricate tapestry that connected all hearts across time. She could sense how each acknowledgement rippled outward, creating small sanctuaries of peace throughout the village. The lighthouse keeper's grief was slowly transforming into gratitude. The playground's accumulated joy continued to nurture new generations of children, and even the undelivered letter had found its purpose in teaching her about the sacred nature of witness. It was during this season of quiet revelation that Lydia's explorations led her to a narrow building, squeezed between the bakers and the chandlers, like a secret waiting to be discovered. The village bookshop bore a painted sign carved in the shape of a whale, and something about its weathered entrance called to her with the same gentle insistence she felt from places rich with forgotten moments. When she stepped through its door on an afternoon, when salt-scented wind carried the promise of spring, she found herself in a space that breathed differently than anywhere else she'd known. The air inside tasted faintly of paper, dust and tea, while stacks of books rose in humble towers that seemed to have grown rather than been arranged. Along the back wall, a kettle steamed next to a jar of honey and a plate of biscuits that appeared to refill themselves by some good-hearted magic. But what struck Lydia most profoundly was the quality of silence, not empty quiet, but the rich stillness that books create when they hold their stories in patient readiness. Behind the counter stood a young man sorting returns with unhurried grace, his movements so deliberate they felt like a lesson in mindfulness. When he looked up, his eyes were the soft grey of riverstones, holding a thoughtful stillness that reminded Lydia of the quiet pools Marin had taught her to seek when the world grew too loud. There was something about his presence that understood the spaces between words, the pauses that held as much meaning as speech itself. "Hello," he said, his voice low and respectful of the quiet already living in the room. "Take your time. The shop does better when nobody rushes it." Lydia nodded. feeling an immediate sense of recognition, not of having met him before, but of encountering someone who moved through the world with the same reverent attention she brought to places touched by forgotten moments. As she began to explore the narrow aisles, she noticed how he handled each volume as if it were a living thing, understanding that books carried not just their author's intentions, but the emotional imprints of every reader who had found solace within their pages. When she paused by a shelf of poetry, her palm resting gently on the worn spines as she felt the accumulated wisdom they held, he didn't question her unusual behavior or offer unwanted explanations. Instead, he simply stepped near enough to be helpful, placed a small stool beside her with quiet care, then returned to his work. The gesture asked nothing of her while offering everything she needed. "You feel it too, don't you?" he said quietly after she had visited several times, not looking up from the book he was shelving. The way some places hold peace instead of noise, even when they're full of human stories. It was the first time someone her own age had acknowledged her sensitivity without making her feel strange or different. Lydia studied his profile as he worked, the careful way he touched each book, the thoughtful pauses before he spoke, the quality of attention he brought to simple tasks that suggested he, too, experienced the world with unusual depth. "The books remember everyone who found comfort in them," she replied, her voice carrying the wonder of recognition. "But it doesn't feel overwhelming here. It feels like a library, where all the stories have learned to whisper instead of shout." He introduced himself as Tobias, with the same gentle courtesy he showed the books, and their friendship began to develop in the quiet spaces between customers and conversations. Unlike the boisterous connections she observed among her schoolmates, their bond grew through shared silences and mutual understanding. When she mentioned feeling the emotional resonance of particular volumes or corners of the shop, he would nod with recognition rather than curiosity, as if her perceptions were simply another way of reading the world's deeper text. In Tobias, Lydia found not just a friend but a kindred spirit who understood that sensitivity could be a form of wisdom, that the ability to perceive emotional undercurrents was a gift to be honored rather than a burden to be managed. The bookshop became their sanctuary, a place where two young hearts learning to navigate the world's complexity could find refuge in the accumulated wisdom of generations, surrounded by stories that reminded them they were not alone in their depth of feeling. The understanding that had grown between Lydia and Tobias in the quiet sanctuary of the bookshop deepened through the gentle rhythm of shared afternoons, their friendship developing like tidal pools, slowly, steadily, each conversation adding another layer of trust. When spring returned to Saltmere with its promise of renewal, their peaceful routine was brightened by news that swept through the village like morning light across calm waters. Clara Whitmore, Lydia's childhood friend whose laughter had echoed through countless games of hide-and-seek among the harbor's weathered pilings, had accepted Samuel's proposal of marriage. The announcement filled Saltmere with the particular joy that accompanies young love. And Clara arrived at the bookshop on an afternoon when salt-scented air carried the green promise of growing things, her cheeks flushed with happiness and her eyes bright as sea glass catching sunlight. "I need your help," she said to Lydia, her voice carrying the breathless excitement of someone standing at the threshold of a new life. "Mrs. Penelope says you have a way of seeing what others miss, and I want to choose a dress that will hold all the love I'm feeling." Tobias looked up from the volume he was cataloguing, his Riverstone eyes reflecting gentle understanding. "The shop does better when nobody rushes it," he said. The same words he'd spoken to Lydia on their first meeting. And somehow Clara understood that this was both permission and blessing. Mrs. Penelope's dress shop occupied a narrow building that seemed to breathe with accumulated dreams, its windows displaying lace and silk like captured moonbeams. When they stepped through its door, Lydia felt the familiar warmth that indicated a place rich with forgotten moments, generations of hopes made tangible in fabric and thread, each gown holding the echo of a young woman's vision of her perfect day. The shop itself seemed to welcome them with gentle sighs, dust motes dancing in afternoon light, while bolts of silk and satin created soft landscapes of possibility. Mrs. Penelope, whose gentle hands had fitted 3 generations of Saltmere brides, moved among her treasures with the reverence of someone who understood that wedding dresses were never merely clothing, but prayers woven in white thread. Clara tried on several gowns, each transformation bringing new expressions of delight as she discovered different versions of herself reflected in antique mirrors. But it was when Mrs. Penelope brought out a particular dress from the back room that Lydia felt the characteristic pull of a forgotten moment seeking acknowledgement. The gown was exquisite, ivory silk that caught light like captured starshine, with delicate embroidery that told stories in silver thread. Yet when Lydia looked at it, she saw beyond its physical beauty to the complex emotional history it carried, like invisible embroidery. "This one has been waiting," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle certainty that had become her signature. "There's something it wants to share." When Clara slipped into the dress, she was transformed into something luminous, but Lydia felt the weight of another story pressing against her awareness. As her fingers touched the silk with characteristic reverence, the forgotten moment revealed itself like morning mist, lifting to reveal familiar landscapes touched with unexpected light. She felt the presence of another bride from decades past, a young woman named Rose who had worn this very gown with trembling hope on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The dress held the echo of that morning's anticipation, the crushing weight of realization as minutes stretched into certainty, and the quiet dignity with which Rose had gathered her skirts and walked back down the aisle alone, but woven through. The sorrow was something unexpected and beautiful, the resilience that had grown from that devastating disappointment. The way Rose had learned to find her own completeness without waiting for someone else to provide it. The dress remembered not just the wedding that didn't happen, but the life that bloomed anyway. Richer and deeper for having weathered disappointment. "She found love eventually," Lydia whispered, her voice carrying wonder at the complexity of human hearts. Different love than she expected, but truer somehow. The dress remembers both stories. Now, the heartbreak that taught her strength and the joy that found her when she was ready. Mrs. Penelope nodded with the quiet satisfaction of someone witnessing a circle complete itself. "Rose married a widower with 2 children 5 years later," she said gently. "Found more happiness in that unexpected family than she ever dreamed possible. Before she passed, she asked me to keep the dress for someone who would understand that every story contributes to love's great tapestry." Standing in that shop, filled with dreams made tangible, Lydia understood another layer of her gift's true purpose. She wasn't just witnessing forgotten moments, but helping others see that every experience, even those that seem incomplete or disappointing, adds meaning to the vast, interconnected story of human connection. When Clara chose that dress, she wasn't just selecting fabric and thread, but accepting the wisdom of a woman who had learned that love arrives in many forms, often wearing different clothes than we imagined. The gown would carry Clara's joy forward while honoring Rose's journey, each story making the other more complete. As they walked home through Saltmere's familiar streets, Tobias carrying their parcels with quiet courtesy, Lydia felt the gentle satisfaction that comes from witnessing love's endless creativity in finding ways to bless the world. The understanding that had bloomed in Mrs. Penelope's dress shop, watching Clara embrace a gown that carried both heartbreak and healing, stayed with Lydia like a gentle current moving beneath still water. In the days that followed, as spring painted Saltmere in shades of hope and the village settled into the contented rhythm that follows a well-celebrated wedding, she found herself listening to something new, not just the forgotten moments themselves, but the quiet voice of purpose that had been growing within her like morning light. She would sit in the familiar embrace of the rocking chair, feeling the accumulated love of generations, and understand with increasing clarity that her gift had been preparing her for something beyond witness. The forgotten moments weren't just seeking acknowledgement, they were offering to become bridges, helping people reconnect with the love that often lay buried beneath layers of time and grief. Rose's story, woven into Clara's joy, had shown her that every experience, even those that seemed incomplete or disappointing, added meaning to love's endless tapestry. "I think I'm meant to do more than just listen," she confided to Marin one morning as they prepared their simple breakfast, the lighthouse beam visible through their window like a patient teacher. The forgotten moments want to help people remember that love never really disappears. It just changes form. Like water becoming mist, becoming rain, Marin's weathered hands paused in their work, and she smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a carefully tended seedling finally break through soil into sunlight. And what does that understanding ask of you? The answer came not in words, but in images that felt like memories of a future already written, a small sanctuary where people could bring objects that held difficult forgotten moments, where healing happened not through forgetting, but through deeper, more complete remembering. She saw herself helping others understand that the grandmother's locket that brought only sadness also held decades of morning kisses, that the child's toy that triggered overwhelming grief also carried countless afternoons of pure joy. Tobias listened to her vision with the same thoughtful attention he brought to arranging books, understanding immediately that this calling was as natural as tide following moon. "The village has been waiting for something like this," he said quietly, his river-stone eyes reflecting gentle certainty. "A place where people can bring what hurts and learn to see the love that lives beneath the pain." They found the perfect space within a month, a narrow building tucked between the Bakers and the Chandlers, its windows facing the harbor, where morning light could dance across polished surfaces. The previous occupant had been a seamstress, and her gentle presence lingered in the careful proportions of the rooms, the way afternoon light fell across the wooden floors, the sense that this had always been a place where broken things were made whole through patient, loving hands. Lydia painted the sign herself, choosing words that felt like an invitation rather than a declaration. "The Memory Garden, where love lives in all its forms." Tobias helped her arrange simple furnishings, chairs that welcomed rather than impressed, shelves where treasured objects could rest with dignity, and a small table where tea could be shared while difficult stories found their voices. The first visitor arrived on a Tuesday morning when fog rolled in from the sea like a soft blessing, muffling the familiar sounds of the harbor. Mrs. Hartwell knocked with the hesitant courtesy of someone carrying invisible weight, her weathered face etched with the particular sorrow of avoiding something too painful to touch, yet too precious to abandon. "I don't know if you can help," she whispered, settling into one of the chairs with careful movements. From her worn handbag, she drew a pocket watch wrapped in faded velvet. "It belonged to my Henry. I can't bear to look at it anymore, but I can't bear to put it away either. It's been sitting on my kitchen table for months, making me cry every time I pass by." Lydia accepted the timepiece with the reverence she brought to all forgotten moments, feeling immediately the complex story it held. The watch pulsed with decades of shared mornings, Henry checking the time before heading to his boat, the gentle ritual of winding it each evening, the way its steady tick had marked the rhythm of their life together. But woven through the grief was something else, the profound gratitude of a love that had been allowed to ripen into something deeper than romance, becoming instead the steady foundation upon which an entire life had been built. "It's not just marking the time you've lost," Lydia said gently, her fingers tracing the watch's worn gold surface. "It's holding all the time you were given. Every morning he checked it before kissing you goodbye. Every evening he wound it while you prepared supper together. The watch remembers being part of your rhythm, part of the love that shaped your days." As Mrs. Hartwell began to see her husband's timepiece, not as a monument to absence, but as a celebration of presence, tears came, not the bitter tears of loss, but the healing tears of gratitude. When she left that afternoon, she carried the watch in her pocket, its gentle ticking no longer a reminder of silence, but a continuation of love made audible. The second visitor came 3 days later, young Nora Whitman, clutching a stuffed rabbit whose ear hung by tired threads. Her mother waited outside while Nora approached Lydia's table with the solemn ceremony of someone performing a sacred duty. "Mum says it's falling apart, and I should get a new one," she announced, her chin lifting with defensive pride. "But I don't want a new one. I want this one." Lydia crouched to be level with the child, feeling immediately the rabbit's rich emotional history. The worn fabric held midnight stories, and fevered forehead soothed by cool hands, 1,000 whispered, "It's okay, I'm here." Moments that had helped a little girl navigate the vast mystery of growing up. "Your rabbit isn't falling apart," Lydia said softly. "It's just full. It's done so much loving that it can't hold any more by itself." She reached for her sewing basket, drawing out blue thread the color of morning sky. "Would you like to help it carry all that love? We can stitch its ear with special thread that knows about being strong and gentle at the same time." As they worked together, Nora's defensive posture melted into wonder. When the ear was secure, Lydia offered a small cotton pouch. "When you're ready, you can tuck some of the love here," she said, placing one of her smooth shells inside. "So your rabbit doesn't have to carry everything alone. Glad you can remember that love grows stronger when it's shared." Word of the memory garden spread through Saltmere with the quiet persistence of morning mist, and soon Lydia found herself tending to a steady stream of visitors who brought their difficult treasures, like wounded birds seeking sanctuary. A father's fishing rod that held both pride and regret, a child's drawing that triggered overwhelming grief, a mother's recipe box that felt too heavy with expectation. Each object found its place in Lydia's gentle ministry of remembering. She learned to create what she thought of as circles of understanding, small gatherings where people could share the complex emotions their treasured objects carried. In these circles, grief was allowed to sit beside gratitude. Regret could acknowledge the love that had inspired it, and forgotten moments found their way back into the light through the simple act of being witnessed by caring hearts. As evening settled over Saltmere on her first month of serving others, Lydia sat in the memory garden, surrounded by the accumulated peace that had begun to gather within its walls. The lighthouse beam swept its faithful arc across darkening waters, and she understood that her greatest gift wasn't her extraordinary perception, but her capacity to hold space for another's forgotten heart. In doing so, she helped them remember that love, in all its forms, never truly disappears. It simply waits to be recognized and woven back into the world's endless story of connection. The quiet ministry that had taken root in the memory garden continued to flourish through the summer months, its influence spreading through Saltmere like morning light across still water. Lydia found herself not just tending to individual sorrows, but witnessing how the village itself was learning to remember more completely. Mrs. Hartwell walked the harbour path with her husband's pocket watch ticking softly against her chest, while young Nora carried her carefully mended rabbit with new confidence. Understanding that worn things could be both fragile and strong, the circles of understanding had become woven into the village's rhythm. Small gatherings where neighbours discovered their individual griefs were threads in a larger tapestry of shared human experience. When autumn painted the cliffs in shades of amber and rust, Saltmere seemed to breathe with deeper contentment, as if the community had learned to honour not just its present joys, but its accumulated wisdom. It was during this season of quiet flourishing that the storm arrived, not with gradual warning, but with the sudden fury that sometimes sweeps in from deep ocean waters, when conditions align in ways that catch even experienced coastal dwellers unprepared. Lydia woke to the sound of shutters straining against their hinges, and the lighthouse beam cutting through darkness, made absolute by racing clouds. But what struck her most profoundly was the emotional resonance. She could feel Saltmere's forgotten moments rising like a tide. Every joy and sorrow that had ever been experienced within its boundaries, suddenly present and demanding acknowledgement. The wind came first, howling through village streets like something wild and desperate, followed by rain that fell not in drops but in sheets of water that seemed determined to reclaim the land for the sea. By morning, when the storm had spent its fury and moved inland like a departing giant, Saltmere revealed itself transformed. The harbour was scattered with debris from boats torn from their moorings, while roofs bore gaps like missing teeth, and the old pier lay, splintered across the rocks. But it was the emotional aftermath that struck Lydia most deeply as she walked through the damaged streets with Marin and Tobias. The forgotten moments that usually whispered from corners and shadows now pulsed with urgent presence, as if the storm's violence had shaken them loose from their careful hiding places. She felt the accumulated weight of every loss Saltmere had ever weathered, every recovery it had managed, every time its people had chosen hope over despair in the face of forces beyond their control. Standing in the village square, where centuries of market days and celebrations had woven a tapestry of community life, Lydia felt the full magnitude of her gift's purpose reveal itself like sunrise after the longest night. The forgotten moments weren't just individual threads of memory, they were the very fabric that held Saltmere together, the invisible foundation upon which the village's resilience had been built through generations of storms, both literal and metaphorical. "We need to gather them," she said to Marin and Tobias, her voice carrying new authority born of understanding. All the forgotten moments that have been shaken loose, not to fix them or put them back where they were, but to help everyone remember what we've survived together, what we've built together, what we carry forward together. The gathering took place 3 days later in the church, the only building large enough to hold the entire village and sturdy enough to have weathered the storm with grace. Lydia stood before her neighbors with the same gentle presence she brought to the memory garden, but magnified by understanding that her gift served not just individuals but the community itself. "The storm took our roofs and windows," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered community like morning light across calm water. "But it couldn't touch what made these buildings homes. That lives in us, in our memories of morning tea shared in familiar kitchens, of children's laughter echoing through rooms that held their growing up, of quiet evenings when love made simple spaces sacred." As villagers began to share their stories, Lydia felt the forgotten moments settling back into their proper places. Old Henrik spoke of a small wooden bird that Astrid had kept on their windowsill, describing not its appearance, but the countless mornings he had watched her dust it with gentle care. Young Tom Fletcher brought a piece of the damaged pier, sharing memories of learning to fish there with his grandfather, of first kisses and quiet strength that the pier had always represented. Mrs. Hartwell's watch ticked steadily as she spoke of evenings when its rhythm had marked the peaceful passage of shared time. Even the undelivered letter from the post office found its voice, as Mr. Rowe explained how it had taught him to be gentler with time, more careful with the connections that crossed his desk. By evening, as the first stars appeared through clearing clouds, and the lighthouse beam resumed its faithful sweep across calming waters, something fundamental had shifted in Saltmere. The physical damage remained, but the storm had revealed what was truly strong, the deep invisible ties that bound them all together. The gathering had not fixed the boats or rebuilt the roofs, but it had helped the village remember its own heart, a heart that beat with the rhythm of resilience, love, and the unwavering belief in the power of shared stories. As people left the church hall, they carried not just their objects, but a renewed understanding that rebuilding Saltmere would be a collective act of love, woven from the countless forgotten moments that had shaped them all. And Lydia discovered that her greatest gift wasn't her ability to perceive these moments, but her capacity to help others weave them back into the living story of connection that would guide them through whatever storms lay ahead. The rebuilding that followed the great storm moved through Saltmere like a gentle tide, each day bringing small acts of restoration that felt less like repairs and more like love made visible. Hammers rang against nails with the rhythm of shared purpose, while neighbors discovered new depths in familiar friendships. The memory garden had become a resting place between tasks, where people came with splinters in their hands and stories in their throats, and Lydia listened until the stories remembered how to breathe on their own. It was at one of the simple tables Tobias had arranged for tea and quiet conversation that Lydia first noticed the child who moved through space with a familiar reverence. Rosie Campbell was perhaps 7 years old, with copper hair that caught afternoon light like autumn leaves and sea-glass eyes that seemed to hold depths beyond her years. She sat beside her mother, arranging oyster shells into patient spirals while her attention drifted toward the walls as if the plaster were trying to speak. The child's small hands touched each shell with deliberate care, waiting, listening, then moving it half an inch with the precision of someone following invisible instructions. When she glanced up, her eyes held the tidal hush of someone listening, for a rhythm nobody else could hear. The same quality of attention Lydia had brought to the world since childhood. "She's been like this since the storm," her mother explained, with a weary smile that still carried sunlight. "Says the rooms are full of voices. I thought it was fright, but she says it isn't scary, just loud." As if summoned by their conversation, Rosie suddenly pressed both palms flat against the tabletop, the way Lydia sometimes touched the old rocking chair, her small face brightening with recognition. The air around the child felt bright and expectant, like the moment before summer rain breaks. Lydia knelt so they were eye-level, her heart stirring with profound recognition. "I'm Lydia," she said, keeping her voice as soft as wool. "When places feel full of voices, I make a little quiet room inside myself. Would you like to try?" Rosie's copper braid nodded, with the eager trust of someone finally meeting another member of their tribe. Lydia placed one of her smooth shells in the child's palm, feeling the familiar warmth of connection that came when forgotten moments found their proper witness. "This one remembers the tide," she whispered, echoing the lessons Marin had taught her so many years ago. "Feel its coolness. Put your heels on the floor, tongue to the roof of your mouth. Count 5 blue things you can see." Rosie's voice grew steady as she named sky, apron stripe, paint on a distant door, the vein on her wrist, the streak in a mussel shell. Her small shoulders lowered by a breath, and wonder filled her expression. "Better," she said, surprised. "They're not shouting anymore." Her mother exhaled a month of worry, and Lydia felt the familiar satisfaction that came from helping someone discover they weren't alone in their sensitivity. Later, when the afternoon tables were cleared and evening gathered like a gentle shawl, she invited them both to the memory garden. They sat near the window where the harbor blinked its patient lights, and Lydia began the same gentle education Marin had once provided. "Before you listen," she taught Rosie, "ask if you are needed now or later. Not everything wants company. Not everything is ready. Love has boundaries, just like gardens have fences." Marin joined them with tea sweetened by honey, and the kind of listening that makes people breathe more easily. She showed Rosie the small practices Lydia had learned years before. How to be a window that lets the world pass through, rather than a well that holds everything. How to acknowledge forgotten moments without drowning in their intensity. "You can carry this for remembering," Marin said, tying a ribbon around the shell and looping it over Rosie's wrist. "When the voices get loud, touch it and remember that you may rest." In the weeks that followed, as Saltmere continued its patient healing, others appeared like stars at dusk, one by one. Young Jonah Pike, shy as driftwood, confessed he could feel weather not in his skin but in his chest, storms arriving as a thickening behind the ribs, calms as a wide, peaceful space. Mrs. Penelope quietly admitted that fabric told her where it wanted to go, which seams would be kinder to a body's history. They began meeting on Thursday evenings when the lighthouse woke and the sky wore its first shy stars. Lydia would open each gathering with the same anchor she had been given and now gave away, feet on the floor, breath like a tide, eyes resting softly on something kind. Then came the sharing, an object, a moment, a dream, while the room learned to breathe with collective understanding. "Be windows," Lydia would say, smiling toward Marin with gratitude for the wisdom passed down. Not wells. Even silence felt held in those circles, like a lullaby sung under one's breath. Teaching changed Lydia's listening. She began to hear the questions beneath the stories, and sometimes the answers lived in the quiet after. One evening, when a hush had gathered like mist, Rosie spoke with the steady certainty of someone repeating the sea's own wisdom. The space between waves is where the shore decides not to be afraid. Lydia's chest loosened with understanding. She had come to guide and found herself guided, the way a lantern learns from the faces it illuminates. In nurturing Rosie's gift, she discovered that her own purpose had evolved once again. From witness to healer to teacher, each role preparing her for the next turn in love's endless spiral. Late one night, after the circle had drifted home through Saltmere's recovering streets, Lydia found Marin resting in the familiar embrace of the rocking chair, her breathing a little shallower than before, but her eyes bright with quiet pride. "You're doing it," Marin whispered, her weathered hand finding Lydia's with the gentle certainty of tides finding shore, teaching them to listen with their hearts, to honor what they hear, to remember that love never disappears, it just changes form. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept its faithful arc across waters that reflected the accumulated peace of their small community, while inside, Lydia felt the deep contentment that comes from understanding one's true calling. She had learned that some gifts are not meant to be carried alone, but shared like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever they find soil prepared by love and tended by gentle, patient hands. The circle of understanding that had grown around Lydia and Rosie continued to meet each Thursday evening, their shared wisdom creating ripples of peace throughout Saltmere's recovering streets. But as autumn painted the cliffs in familiar shades of amber and rust, Lydia began to notice subtle changes in the woman who had been her first teacher, her unwavering guide through the mysteries of forgotten moments. Marin moved through their cottage with the same loving attention she had always shown, but her steps had grown more deliberate, her breathing softer, as if she were learning to conserve something precious for the journey ahead. The changes came gradually, like morning mist lifting to reveal familiar landscapes touched with new light. Marin spent longer hours in the rocking chair, not from weakness but from a growing understanding that some of life's most important work happens in stillness. She would sit with her weathered hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed but her face peaceful, as if she were listening to music that played just beyond the edge of hearing. "I'm not leaving," she said one morning, as they prepared their simple breakfast, her voice carrying the particular tenderness that comes with important truths. "I'm just learning to be present in a different way, the way love learns to be present when bodies grow tired but hearts remain strong." The village seemed to sense the approaching change without needing words. Neighbors arrived with offerings that spoke of respect and gratitude. Mrs. Hartwell's honey cake that tasted of summer afternoons. Old Henrik's carefully tended flowers from Astrid's recovering garden. Smooth stones and shells that children had found on the beach and felt moved to share. These gifts accumulated on their windowsill like prayers made visible, each one acknowledging the quiet ministry Marin had provided throughout her long life. Tobias visited more frequently during these weeks, bringing books that might comfort and tea that tasted of distant gardens. His presence had become another form of quiet anchor, his understanding of Lydia's gift deepened by witnessing how she tended to Marin's gradual transition. Rosie would arrive after her lessons, copper hair catching afternoon light, bringing paper stars strung on twine, their uneven points asking nothing but offering brightness wherever winter sunlight could pass through. "I want to show you something," Marin said on an evening when the lighthouse beam seemed especially bright against gathering clouds. She led Lydia to the small wooden chest that had always sat beneath the bedroom window, its surface worn smooth by decades of gentle handling. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay objects that told the story of their family's gift. A journal filled with careful observations about forgotten moments, shells arranged according to some system only Marin understood, and letters from people whose lives had been touched by her quiet wisdom. "This is how it continues," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had tended a garden well and now watched it prepare for new seasons. Not the objects themselves, but the understanding they represent. The knowledge that love leaves traces everywhere, that some people are called to witness and tend to those traces, that healing happens when we learn to see forgotten moments not as hauntings but as, blessings. Lydia learned to tend to forgotten moments that belonged to her own life, the countless afternoons spent learning at Marin's side, the gentle wisdom passed down through generations of women who understood that love was both gift and responsibility. She felt the accumulated warmth of morning conversations over tea, of evening lessons about creating quiet spaces, of hands that had guided her toward understanding her extraordinary sensitivity as blessing rather than burden. On a mild day between winter storms, Marin asked to visit the pier one final time. They walked slowly, Tobias carrying a small stool while Lydia spread a blanket, where the weathered boards remembered a century of footsteps. Waves made small hands of foam and reached for the shore with patient persistence, and Marin rested with her face to the light, breathing deeply of the salt-scented air that had been her companion for so many decades. "Do you hear it?" she asked, eyes half closed against the gentle brightness. "The space between waves," Lydia answered, understanding blooming like sunrise. "Where the shore remembers it is strong." Marin smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher, hearing her own words returned, made truer by the student's life. She slipped one of her smooth shells into a crack between boards. "For the ones who come after," she whispered, and the breeze touched their cheeks like agreement. The final lesson came on a morning when salt-scented wind carried the green promise of growing things in the lighthouse. Beam caught dewdrops like scattered diamonds. Marin asked to be helped to the rocking chair, where she settled with the deep contentment of someone coming home after a long journey. "The chair knows," she said, her hands tracing its familiar arms with infinite tenderness. "It holds all the love we've shared, all the wisdom that's been passed down, all the quiet moments when understanding bloomed between us. When I'm gone, sit here and listen. You'll hear not just my voice, but all the voices of the women who rocked their children here, who found peace in its gentle rhythm." She passed quietly that afternoon, her breathing growing softer, until it merged with the tide's eternal rhythm. Lydia held her hand and felt not emptiness but fullness, the profound completion that comes when a life has been lived with purpose and love has been passed forward intact. In the rocking chair that had witnessed so many beginnings, Marin found her peaceful ending, surrounded by the accumulated love of generations and the gentle certainty that some things are too beautiful to end. They simply change form and continue, like love itself, eternal and ever-renewing. The seasons that followed Marin's peaceful passing moved through Saltmere like gentle tides, each bringing its own quiet gifts of renewal and understanding. The cottage learned a softer way of breathing, morning light slipping through lace curtains, to find Lydia settled in the rocking chair that now held the accumulated wisdom of generations. She had grown into the role that had been waiting for her all along, keeper of forgotten moments, tender of invisible threads, the gentle lighthouse that helped others navigate their own emotional storms. The memory garden had flourished beyond anything she could have imagined in those early days when she first understood her calling. What had begun as a small sanctuary for individual healing had become the beating heart of Saltmere's continuing recovery, its windows glowing with the soft light of evening gatherings where people learned to honor their sensitivity as wisdom rather than burden. The Thursday circles had grown to include visitors from neighboring villages, drawn by stories of a place where forgotten moments found their voices through gentle witness. Rosie had grown into her gift with the grace of morning light across calm water, her copper hair now braided with shells and her sea-glass eyes bright with understanding. She moved through the memory garden with the same reverent attention Lydia had once shown, creating quiet spaces wherever the forgotten moments grew too insistent. Under Lydia's patient guidance, she had learned to be a window rather than a well, letting love pass through her without drowning in its intensity. "You're ready," Lydia told her one spring afternoon as they arranged flowers that had bloomed defiantly against the salt winds. "Ready to tend to the forgotten moments that only you can hear. Ready to help others understand that what makes them different makes them precious." Tobias remained her steadfast companion, his presence a quiet anchor that allowed Lydia's gift to flourish without overwhelming her. Their love had grown through shared silences and mutual understanding, built on the knowledge that some connections transcend the need for constant words. He would bring her tea as she sat in the rocking chair, or simply rest his hand on its worn arm, acknowledging all the love it had learned to carry. The village itself had become a living testament to the power of acknowledged love. Old Henrik still tended Astrid's garden, bringing flowers to the pier each Sunday in a ritual he called tidying the week. Mrs. Hartwell walked the harbour path with her husband's pocket watch ticking softly against her chest, its rhythm no longer marking absence, but celebrating presence. The lighthouse beam continued its faithful sweep across the waters, and Lydia often thought of it as a symbol of their work, not to change the darkness, but to offer consistent, guiding light. As evening settled over Saltmere with its familiar promise of rest, Lydia found herself walking the paths of her childhood with different eyes. The playground behind the church still pulsed with generations of joy, but now she could feel her own laughter, woven into its emotional tapestry. The pier where Marin had taught her about boundaries and breathing held new layers of memory, countless conversations that had shaped her understanding, gentle lessons that had prepared her for a life of service. The cottage had become a living sanctuary where forgotten moments were honored and healing happened through the simple act of being witnessed by caring hearts. The kitchen windowsill displayed shells that visitors had left as offerings of gratitude, each one telling its own story while contributing to the larger narrative of a home where love was understood to be both gift and responsibility. On this particular evening, as the last rays of sun painted the western sky in hues of rose and lavender, Lydia settled into the rocking chair that had been her first teacher in the mysteries of forgotten moments. Rosie was guiding a small group in the main room, her voice a soft hum against the gentle murmur of the waves. Tobias moved through their garden, tending herbs with the same patient care he brought to arranging books, his silhouette a familiar comfort against the fading light. She closed her eyes and felt the gentle rhythm of the tide, the steady beat of her own heart and the soft, continuous hum of all the forgotten moments that had been woven into a single beautiful song. She had learned that her greatest achievement wasn't any single act of healing, but the quiet legacy of teaching others to honor the invisible threads that connected all hearts across time. Love, she understood now, never truly disappeared. It simply changed form, Like water becoming mist, becoming rain, always returning, always nourishing, always waiting to be remembered and woven back into the world's endless story of connection. She had become part of the tapestry she had spent her life weaving, another thread in love's eternal story, another voice in the gentle chorus that sang of resilience, witness, and the unwavering belief in the power of shared understanding. The lighthouse beams swept across darkening waters, carrying with it the accumulated love of generations who had learned that some things are too beautiful to end. They simply change form and continue, like morning light becoming evening stars, like whispered lullabies becoming the wind's gentle song, like love itself, eternal and ever-renewing. And with that gentle understanding, she stretched into the peace that comes with knowing one's place in the vast, interconnected story of human hearts learning to remember, to witness and to love without condition. Somewhere in the rhythm of the tide, all the forgotten moments of Saltmere found their voices and sang together in perfect, eternal harmony. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.